Okay, so we're going to be doing it slightly differently tonight, as you know. We would be doing it as mentioned. It'll be more of a conversation. So as a start, I guess both of you would have a disclaimer on tonight's discussion. Craig, would you like to share that with us before we start?
Sure. Mike and I were talking about this the other day, and although our goal tonight is to share about processes and how you can prepare and also how you can best perform during your Viva, we wanted to start with a disclaimer that every Viva is different. Every university has different standards, different processes. How you prepare for it and how you can go through it can be quite standardized, but it's always important not just what we talk about tonight, but spend some time with your supervisor about the unique nuances and expectations that there might be with your university. For example, are you expected to give a presentation? How long will you have? What is expected out of you, even down to how many people will be in the room and who will be in the room with you. I'm not sure if you want to add anything extra to that particular Mike. Great.
No, thank you for Craig. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I think Craig has summed it up very nicely that every Viva is different and every university has very different processes. Some universities have a Viva process where the Viva being the presentation. Other universities don't. It's simply just a written examination. Adding on to what Craig has said, I would always encourage you to get in touch with someone in your own institution who has just completed it, because they've gone through the process, so they can always tell you. And most institutions would require an external examiner or internal examiner, or a chair of the Viva process. You can simply find that out by asking whoever is the research director or PhD director in your school, and you can just have a chat with them. They may give you insights into the process, but it also might help alleviate some of your concerns before going into a Viva. Yeah, that's all I can add.
Fantastic.
All right. So, now that the legal stuff is out of the way, let's begin. Mike, I understand that you were an examiner for a Viva recently. Would you mind telling us a little bit about the experience?
Yeah, so I'll put it in this way. It's in the last month I've examined three. I've had three Vivas, and each has been sort of quite different, and a different experience for me as an examiner, and probably a different experience for the candidate as a examinee. And all three were in different institutions located in different countries. So we had a Malaysian institution, we had one that was from Australia, and one from New Zealand. So quite a broad category. And how I can explain this is they ranged from really good and positive to as expected to as not expected. But the interesting thing is that all three passed. All three were given recommendations of either two was minor revisions based on their institution requirements, and one was given a more substantial major revisions. Now, before I progress, I'm going to just make a caveat here. Again, each institution is different, and the rules surrounding around the outcome of a Viva is also very different. So, for example, at the University of Nottingham, if you are given a minor, if you're a full-time student, it's usually deemed as something that would be relatively simple clarifications or corrections or typos or something like that, and you may be given a month to 3 months to complete it, no more than 3 months. If you're given a major, usually it's 6 or more months, or sometimes up to a year. And then you can have an option of, or there is also an option of revise and resubmit, where the candidate has to go back and completely make some dramatic changes. In other institutions, in the ones that I just went to, minor was up to 6 months, and a major was a year or more. So each institution is different, and I'll talk a little bit later about how you evaluate it. So I guess we want to start with what's a bad one. I wouldn't say a bad one, but one that wasn't sort of the best it could be. And then we can talk about a little bit more of a more positive one that was sort of above expectation. So what was something that stood out with the one that wasn't as good as we expected is obviously it wasn't a matter of a student or candidate, sorry, not being prepared, but a candidate not understanding their thesis, not understanding the core elements of their thesis and how it all came to sort of gather. And some obvious signs here was not being able to answer the questions. Now, the candidate knew the topic, was quite obvious that they knew the topic, but they weren't answering the questions about why certain things were done, how certain things were done, and why certain information was excluded or excluded. In fact, what became sort of obvious that was very early on was when asked a question, the candidate was sort of stumped to give an answer, the candidate would respond by, thank you, I'll incorporate that into my revisions. Thank you, I'll incorporate. So this showed to the board of examiners, the external examiners, plus the internal, that while the work was done, there was thinking into the work, there was a lack of clear understanding of the work and how it all came together. Towards the end of the thesis, the candidate obviously became a little bit flustered with the process, and that is natural because it can take a while. But the answers were just sort of repeating the name of the examiners and saying thank you. So it wasn't really a conversation that was happening between the internal, external examiners and the candidate. It was more of us just putting forward a point and then the candidate saying, yes, okay, thank you, bye. And this led to, as you can imagine, a major revision that had to be, because the Viva was considered of poor standing in that general. In contrast, a better one that I had, the candidate obviously had been quite prepared for it, but not overly prepared with scripted answers, because that's always a very common sign that people can get unstuck with the process. When they're expecting a question and the examiner throws an unexpected question, they often just repeat a pre-scripted answer. So the candidate was articulate, able to point their view. They did a presentation that looked at the contribution of the thesis and why the thesis was done and how it was done and its eventual contribution. The candidate asked questions, not only for clarification from the examiners, but why they had asked that question. And they made it very clear in their presentation and their Viva that this is what I am looking at, and this is the scope within my work, and this is outside of my work. So they both welcomed suggestions and rebutted any sort of potential criticism put forward by the candidate. So that made for a very lively and entertaining Viva. It was on time, and all the elements were there. And subsequently, this person was given a very minor correction, but it was generally a good thesis anyway. Yeah. So that was that's my experience, and I'm happy to delve into it a little bit more as we go along. I'll maybe open it up to Craig. Maybe he's got some questions for Farrell if you want to follow on from that.
I think. Oh, go for it, Farrell.
No, just if anything you have, go ahead.
Yeah. So actually, I wanted to touch on what Mike had said about conversation and the Viva experience being a conversation in itself. And I actually just wanted to talk about the idea that, you know, you mentioned scripted answers, and I think most of us by default, for whatever reason, go to the concept of scripted answers, but we've got to go a lot further. We've got to develop a skill within ourselves to be able to do storytelling. And we have to be able to storytell our dissertation. We have to have a narrative that we can use, but not get confused with it being an answer to questions, but actually being able to share what our research is about, and then to be able to break that down later with questions. I know we're going to talk about practicing, practicing for the Viva a little bit later in the session, but I think it also comes down to we need to be able to practice explaining what our research is to people who may not be particularly familiar with it. Almost to the point, it's like the mum test. And Mike might hate me for this because I think Mike's mum's also a professor, if I'm not mistaken. But most of us don't have a parent who is a university professor. So being able to explain just what we've done as our research to somebody who's not familiar with it is a useful skill. To be able to answer in greater depth is also a very useful but different skill from that particular one as well. I think, to me, that's a very important skill for a researcher to have. And it's not just a skill that we need at Viva time. It's a skill that will take us through the remainder of our career, whether we stay on at universities, as Mike and to some extent I have, or whether we go into industry. The ability to storytell, the ability to develop a narrative that shares what we have done with others, that is not necessarily a chapter by chapter blow, of what we have. We need to be able to tell a story, not just summarize what's been written down.
And I think that's what makes a sort of a good Viva, is that they move beyond that summary scripted answers and explain whole thesis. And don't remember that when you are asked questions about your thesis, you can think about some questions being in from like a funnel, that you have a very broad question. So for example, one question that I always like to ask is, so why this piece of research? Why did you do it? And you can imagine how many people are stumped by that. They go straight into explaining what their problem statement is. And at that point, I've known that someone has practiced their answers, when really I will treat it as a funnel and then eventually funnel it down to asking very specific questions about why your research question is like this. How does your research question match your proposed methodology or your gap? So the general question, like I said before, that I ask is, why this piece of research? I just want to see what was your motivation for doing it. And everyone comes into the thesis with a different motivation. Someone might say to me, I'm really passionate about coaching and I really wanted to learn about coaching and its impact. Fine. Somebody else has said before, I observed. So one of the theses that I observed, that candidate described a little bit of their life story about how they had been working in the tourism industry and observed this problem and just wanted to know more about it. Therefore, they did their thesis. And that, I think, comes across very nicely to the examiner, that this person has undertaken this research 3 years or more sometimes, simply because they are really passionate about what they're doing, right? They have a genuine passion. It's not just a research problem or a gap that they've figured out from the literature, and that's what we're going to present. Yeah.
I want to touch on something before Farrell asks us another question. Many of the people in the room tonight will be English as an additional language candidates, i.e. in the sense that they won't be defending their Viva in their mother tongue or their first language. And that can pose, I guess, in a way for some of us, a challenge, because the meaning of questions might get lost. If we feel that's the case as a candidate, what can we do to make sure that we have actually understood what the question was asked.
Are you asking me?
I am. Sorry, Mike, I am asking you. And okay. I think you handled that beautifully.
Right. So the first thing that I want to make point is that the thesis defense or the Viva defense doesn't have to be rushed. Okay, it's okay to state your position very early on regarding your language. Now, language can come in. Language is not an indicator of ability. Let's put that straight with us. I've worked with lots of students from around the world whose English may not be the same as mine, being an Australian, it's native to my tongue, or Craig's a New Zealander, but their written ability is high. But they may also suffer from, not that they don't understand, but sometimes we as Australians, we tend to speak a bit fast, and that translation process gets a little bit lost. So one candidate I had, and this is a few years ago, they said, look, English is not my first language. Could you please slow down when you're asking a question? Can you give me some time to think about it and comprehend it in my language? But also, don't be afraid of asking for further clarification to the examiners. It's not, this process is not one way. It's not just us as examiners asking you questions and expecting an answer, but you can say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that question. Could you repeat it? Could you slow down? Could you rephrase it for me? What is it that you are trying to address or trying to ask me? These things can actually help you. And this is also part of that time management and slowing down, because you don't want to rush through the thesis and miss any important information or give the wrong information. So the slower you take it, I mean, you don't want it to be 5 or 6 hours. That's a marathon, but some have gone that far. Some have gone that far. But you want to keep it at a reasonable pace that you are comfortable with. Okay. So that would be my strategy there.
Thanks, Mike. Farrell.
So Craig, since you want to talk a little bit about, you want to add any tips or practices to add to that? I mean, share your thoughts as well about outlining your research or storytelling or having a narrative as part of the Viva process.
I've kind of done that section. You got the wrong question, Farrell.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at the, right. Okay, I guess this goes to the both of you. Is how important is it to justify or explain your decisions during your research?
Craig, do you want to start off?
Sure. Personally, I think the major contribution that the Viva makes to your experience is for you to be able to explain your decision making. I always talk about, as a researcher, you're making choices almost every day. I mean, what to read, what protocols to use, what methodology to employ, what to change, what to adjust. How do you massage your approach as you experience different things through the research journey? And I think it becomes very important at the Viva stage that you are able to explain some of the key decisions. Now, being able to explain and being asked to explain is going to be two different things. You may or may not be asked in certain cases, but I think one has to be prepared so that you can talk about, why did you do it this way? Why did a process go one way and not another way? A story I have related to this, one of Farrell and my former staff from many years ago is now an assistant professor of communications at a university in Tanzania. And I sat in on her Viva 2 years ago. She did a good job. I think I would say the Viva was midway. There were some minor corrections to be done, but there were some really good questions. And one of her challenges was, and remember here, the context is she was researching in Africa about Southeast Asia. So global South, and Global South. So keep that in mind. She was using a theoretical framework from 1980. And most of us, Mike's sort of sitting there thinking, that's old as well. I sat there thinking, are you kidding me? Because it was dated. It was out of date for the current times. And they pulled her up on that. They said, look, you used a theoretical framework that is very much out of date. And I thought, she's in for a really hard time. She responded. She took a few moments. She took that time. She responded. She said, look, nobody has touched this area in relation to the African subcontinent for many years. The alternative theoretical frameworks that are there don't apply particularly well culturally. So for me, it was a point of going to something that worked and elaborating and building on it. And she actually handled the question very, very well with respect to that. She handled something that I thought was going to be a nail in her coffin, and she turned that whole experience around, because right after, they actually were, the panel responded very well to the way in which she addressed that. What I liked about it was, look, I also thought it was dated, and I would have asked the same question. But I understood her decision processes, and then from it, I understood how she launched her research and her activities based upon those set of decision processes. Research is not about being 100% right. It is about making intelligent decisions and showcasing what happens as a snowball effect from those intelligent decisions. Sometimes we're backed into a corner where we don't have a lot of anything to go from. Maybe we don't have enough data compared to what we like. We might have got, say, for example, 21 responses to a survey, and we had hoped for 212. At the end of the day, you still have to do your research based on what you have in front of you and what you can access as well. Coming from Africa, it's very different access to resources, to libraries, to what Mike and I are privileged with in terms of access from Nottingham University or from some of the other universities that we collaborate with. So we simply get to defend and say, this is what I had to start with. This is what I did with it. This is why I did this with it. And that becomes that defending our decision making, which I feel is very important for us to be prepared for. You may or may not be asked, but it's good to know or good to be able to explain why you've gone a particular way.
So I would sort of add to that, and again, reflecting on these couple of experiences. So it's about justifying your decision in a logical and in a supportive manner, because it shows to the examiners that you've understood the material, you've understood what has come before you, and you're able to draw your own conclusions. So a good example was one from Australia, where asked about the choice of methodology to justify their choice, given that there is a range of methodological approaches that one could have done for this thesis. The candidate simply said that given the context, given the access and the sensitivities, I chose this, and prior research has utilized this approach and deemed it appropriate. In the case of the one that wasn't so good, the answer was the journals all have this amount of interviews in it, which is a very poor response, because you're not submitting to a journal. You are submitting a thesis. The requirements for a thesis are different from the requirements of a journal. So obviously, in this case, we saw that the candidate was not driven by an internal decision themselves that they made. about the relevant choice and the number of interviews, but they had gone to an external source, and that is a journal, and looked at studies in there and said, this is what the journal expects, so I'm going to do it. And this was something that was flagged very heavily against the candidate, because at this stage, you really want to be able to justify everything with relevance. That's the important bit. Yeah.
I just made a note. I mean, ultimately, it demonstrates your ability as a researcher to solve problems. And that's something you want to show through. Having something else, like the journal example, solve the problem or dictate to you doesn't showcase your skills. That showcases your ability to follow something else and just toe the line. But as a researcher, we want to be able to see that you can think. I want to use the word creatively, but let's just say think competently to solve problems and to overcome little speed bumps that we have. Okay, Farrell.
Yep. All right. So, Mike, how should a candidate deal with, comments, criticisms, and challenging questions? I mean, obviously that's part of the process, but how can they deal with them?
That's a really good one. So I think this comes down to your own individual skill. I mean, you've got to have a little bit of thick skin in the game, and by that I mean that you've got to be able to take the criticism that is due and that is appropriate. Now, this often is sort of harder to do than actually to say, because you've invested in your thesis a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it is your baby. Let's have a look at it that way. And it is the most beautiful thing ever produced by you. And that's your view of it. And you are staunchly defending it. That's the whole point of the Viva. So when often people are asked to justify a choice of why did you choose one variable, or why did you choose or define a concept, they often get very defensive about it. But as sort of Craig said, there's nothing to get defensive about. What we're just trying here is not to say, oh, you did right here or you did wrong. That's not the point of the examiners. The point of the examiners is, as it goes back to understanding your thought processes, right? Because like Craig said, there's a lot of decisions made, micro decisions in the thesis in building up to it. What choice of concept do I use? What literature do I base it on? And we want to know where your rationale is coming in. But then you may also get questions which are very, very scrutinizing, right? Let's say, why did you use this scale? Or why did you use this word and not? And how do you deal with that sort of criticism? Well, first of all, you may have a talk with your supervisor, and also maybe the chair of the Viva should then step in at that point and say, no, this is a personal criticism. It is not a criticism of the work that is in front, okay? And you can stop that, and this is where you've got to have the agency and the power to say, okay, this is out of line. This is not within the scope of my thesis. So why are you asking this question? What's your rationale for asking this question as well? If it is a really tough question and you don't have an answer to it, and it can happen, the answer to this is, again, not to get defensive and say, thank you for those insights. I wasn't thinking of those at the time, but at hindsight, I can see where you're coming from. But again, doubling down and saying, this is the scope of my thesis. This is the decisions I made. Therefore, I'm kind of here as well. It's you being comfortable in that space. That's all I can say.
I think just allow me to add a couple of random thoughts to this one as well, because I always remember the thing that I keep advising candidates is, by the time you've gone through about a year of your doctorate, you are the expert in the room. It doesn't mean you know everything. It's exactly as you said, but you are the expert in the room. And for many people, even at Viva stage, there's still a little bit of imposter syndrome. So we've got to work on ways to reassure ourselves that we do pretty much know what we're on about at that stage. But also, it's, as we've talked about before when we've done some of the publishing sessions together, it's about knowing that we're not always going to have every answer, or somebody's going to bring a different perspective to it that we have to think about. And we have to recognize that it's okay not to be able to answer something. And I think you did touch that quite well, but maybe just to reinforce it, it's okay to say, look, that's outside of the scope of where I'd looked at, or that's something to think about, or worse. I'll touch on this. Between submission and Viva, things get published and things might change. It's our job to still keep up to date with the literature, but of course that's not reflected in the dissertation that we've submitted. And we might be asked about something that's happened in that time frame as well, that we can't answer from our dissertation because done and dusted, but we still can showcase that we've kept abreast with what is developing as time has progressed. I know one of Farrell's friends who did a webinar for us a couple of years ago had something like 10 months between submission and Viva, purely because of COVID and university hierarchies. But a lot had changed within that time. And she was actually asked to reflect on that as well.
Right. Now, also, this question is for Mike as well as Craig. How should a candidate address the requested changes after the Viva?
You want to start off, Craig, with that one?
Yeah, maybe Craig can start off.
Sure. So I'm going to say one point only, and then I'll let Mike touch on anything else he wants to cover. Not every change requested has to be made. You do not have to agree with everything, but you do need to give it due consideration, and also to be able to defend either a change that you're making and how it has gone, or to defend where you say, actually, I want to push back on this particular suggestion. It's very easy to go into the process feeling a little bit nervous, but also good about it. Coming out and being told, well, there's only a few things you need to look at, and to go and do them automatically. But you've also got a responsibility to your research, to yourself, and to the knowledge that you have produced, to make sure that you're doing it in a right way. So being able to push back, or recognizing that there are times that you could push back on that, is important. The pushback shouldn't be during the Viva. The pushback should come in your written responses later. Mike.
Yeah. So I think you've touched on some great points there, and I'd like to just sort of add a little bit more how the process works. So with the Viva, and usually, and this is sort of the British and the Australian standards or whatever, and it could be again different in your country, you would have 2 external examiners. So they would be independent examiners who do not know your work or are not related in any way or shape or have had any history with your supervisor. So they would go through the manuscript that you've submitted, your thesis, and there's usually a form to fill out and asking you to comment on the strengths and weaknesses or areas of concern in sort of several areas, usually around problem framing, introduction, literature review, methodology, findings, etc. So these are what we call independent reviewer reports. And what happens is they're usually submitted before the Viva actually commences to the chair of the Viva. And then this process of questioning goes on. You often have a presentation that you may do, and then you go and ask a number of questions. So getting your presentation right is also quite an important skill, because you want to convey enough information that allows for future clarification and discussion. That's where you want to take the discussion. You don't want to over-present a lot of things in your presentation so that it starts to become a little bit like a nitpicking exercise that they focus on. So getting back to the process, they submit, and then usually the chair of the Viva, so who looks after the Viva process, would then compile those reports. And we'd have a debrief and say, okay, do we both kind of come to the same conclusion? What are some areas of concern? Or what needs to be improved? Sometimes there isn't anything. And then those reports get compiled together and submitted to you as a candidate. And usually it's a few weeks afterwards that is submitted. And that's where you treat this as like a response to a reviewer's in a journal. You've got an opportunity to make those corrections. And as Craig said, some of them can actually be quite minor corrections, like maybe suggesting that you fix up some typos, think about word choice or whatever. Very easy to do. Others can be structural, just saying, maybe you need to move some things around in the thesis. And others can be more major. So they want to see substantial pieces of addition to the text, maybe withdrawal, whatever. But in this document that you respond to those, you have to show and highlight where those changes are and sort of discuss why you've made those changes. So if you've added a paragraph, because it was asked, you say, I've added a paragraph on chapter 5, section 4.5.3 or whatever. So it is an opportunity for you to engage. Now, even before you start to get to the revisions, whether they are minor, my biggest suggestion is just put it away for a while, okay? A week or so is not going to kill you, right? Because you've really just got this one last chance. That's it, right? You don't want to stuff it up anymore. Not to say that you've made a mistake, but if there is something that you've overdone, and there has been cases where people have overdone what's required, and the thesis now has looked different, and they've had to go back to the entire process. So you want to do it right. Have a conversation and a chat with your supervisor. Okay. Think exactly what is required. And again, if it is in doubt and you don't understand what is written there or required, you can have a right to respond back to the external examiner and ask them, could you clarify why you included this? Because sometimes as examiners, we also make mistakes. We may miss a particular section of the report of your thesis. Remember, it's a huge document. Now, we may not have seen that section, or we may have read it and forgot about it. So that does happen as well, and it's good to remind them. Then the process of the revisions starts, right? But again, I would consult with your supervisor on how you're going to tackle those revisions and not just jump into them. Unless they come back as really minor typos on page 4, you forgot to put an E or a full stop. Sometimes they do, then by all means, go do it the next day and put yourself out of misery by submitting it again. But that's the general trend that I would recommend people.
Great. How should a candidate practice for their Viva?
I kind of touched on this earlier. Use the mum test. I think it's there's many different ways. One, you practice with friends and family. You practice with your supervisor. You come to an organization like the Third Degree, and you pay professionals to do a practice with and to work through some of the typical questions. But I'm going to say, before you do any of that, you need to get yourself a list of what the typical questions that might be asked or what could be included in a Viva, and spend some time going through those yourself. For me, I'm a huge fan of having an annotated dissertation. And this is where you actually bring in I want to call a fresh copy of your dissertation to your Viva, but you actually use sticky notes and other things, and you have certain sections highlighted for ease of access and so forth. You need to know within yourself where the key pieces are. But also, if you reflect on the typical questions, you're also going to know, where do I have to go back to refer to something, or to come, be able to respond to it with, say, a page reference or a specific citation or quote that you want.
I'm going to give you. I'm going to stop you there and give you a really interesting example of someone I met. And if you want to go down this road, but apparently it worked for him. So what they had done is they had used AI to read their thesis into an audio book, and they would go for walks in the morning and in the evening, and they would listen to it, to their own thesis. I know it could be a bit boring, but he said it really helped him because it kind of got into his memory a lot, right? He kind of knew after listening to it a few times.
I could actually see that really working.
Yeah.
Because we get used to it from one perspective, which is the written. We're not used to it from an auditory perspective.
So just a bit of a sidebar here. I did a similar approach when I was doing my thesis with my interviews. And what I did is, we all go and we all record our interviews before transcription. What I would do is on my hour-long commute to work, I would listen to them on my phone, an hour one way and an hour back. So I did about 30 interviews. And I had a really in-depth knowledge about all the nuances of how they were speaking, the change in voice and everything, and I could pinpoint where and what they were saying. So it works for some people, obviously it doesn't, but it's another method of kind of, just not reading your thesis, but listening to your thesis.
I really like that, because people are now thinking, how can I embrace AI ethically? And that's a fantastic example of how you can use the different tools for yourself. It's not going to work for everybody, but it is going to work for a good number of people, which I think is great. I think if the one message I would like to get across is, don't not practice. Some form of practice, some form of opportunity to get you engaged with what might be coming up, or what the content is in a different way, such as AI is extremely valuable.
And at the same time, don't just, there's a lot of websites that you could go to that will say, what are the typical thesis questions? And we can get prefixated with. But like I said earlier, one way is just to ask someone who's gone through it recently. Get in touch with them, say, what types of questions did they ask? And think around and outside of those questions as well. So instead of, just saying, can you tell me what your contribution to the literature is? You could reverse that and practice by saying, what am I not contributing to, and why not? That could help, just reverse your thinking, because people will ask the question in different ways. They're not always going to ask it as scripted, and the asking will also be based on your responses as well. So remember, as examiners, we're not just sitting there with a list of questions going next, next, next. We're listening to your responses, to what you say. So sometimes if you've answered it quite nicely and there's nothing else to say, we may skip a few questions and go to another one. If you fail to answer it, or you've exposed a lot more issues, then we may ask deeper questions. And this was typically the case in the last thesis, but I said it didn't really go that well. The inability to answer and to not answer, it caused a lot more questions to be asked, right? And that made the candidate obviously a bit more, on the spot, where it didn't need to be.
And that comes back to our ability to be storytellers, to be able to communicate our research to audiences of different levels of exposure to it, or awareness of our topic as well. Okay, Farrell.
So So I guess this is going to be a final question before we open it up to you guys, and this is addressed to both you and of course to Mike as well. I think a lot of them here are closer to the Viva, but there are others that are early in the journey. So how can a candidate apply some of these tips to their proposal defense or even their annual review?
Yeah, good question. You can treat your annual reviews as kind of a bit of a warm-up. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, this is something that candidates often just do. There's an expectation or unrealistic expectation that you go there and that you get bombarded with questions. It's actually, as I said, a two-way process. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Even if you during your let's say proposal defense, you may ask, what do the examiners think my contribution is? Okay, what are your examiners' thoughts on if I didn't use this methodology and use the different methodology? How would your examiners, internal examiners in this case, react to that? These can give you some kind of unique insights as to how somebody might view what the piece of work that you're doing, or if they suggest something else. And again, this comes with the art of being a little bit more confident, but you can practice that. Okay, you can practice that in a sort of non-scripted way, but just be active in your listening. That's one thing. Yeah.
I'm not going to add to that. I think Mike summed that up really well, other than just by saying, look, the skills are transferable at all stages for us.
Yeah. So shall we open this up to the chat?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic. Have there been questions in the chat box, Farrell?
A couple of questions from so I'm going to read the ones that are from Jacques first. He goes, what are the usual questions asked in Viva? Significantly different from defense or pre-Viva? And the other one being, is the presentation skill of the candidate important for the Viva?
Okay, so
anyway.
Can we hit these one at a time, Farrell?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the first one, because my connection went a little bit dodgy and I couldn't quite hear everything.
What are the usual questions asked in Viva? Significantly different from the questions asked in proposal defense or pre-Viva?
Okay, so the questions that might be asked, of course, they differ according to who is the person asking them, but you can get some generic themes. And, again, each one is going to be different. It's going to be asked in a different way, but there are some very generic themes. If you simply go into Google and you go typical Viva questions, you'll get screeds and screeds of pages. And even after this, I'm going to share a couple of pages of a couple of websites that have questions. I want to make it a more interesting interaction, and I'm going to ask Mike a question. What's your favorite question to ask, Mike? Do you sort of, like, I focus on decision for methodology as the key thing that I look at. Do you have like an area or a sort of a theme that you like to focus on as sort of something you have to get out of that experience as the examiner?
Yeah, so I like to, bit of a curveball person. I like to ask them often, how does your research make a difference in everyday practice? Whether you're looking at, let's say, organizations, whether you're looking at individuals or whatever, I really like to ask them. And sometimes I can see from that how much thought a person has put into their thesis, whether the thesis has been so constructed in a way that it is purely theoretical. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. What I'm saying is that I look at it and say, if you are dealing with populations, if you are dealing with organizations, if you're dealing with society, what is the outcome of this? If you were to walk down the local street and see a problem, how would you use your thesis to help that issue? And and I think when we talk about the contributions of our thesis, we think of it simply, and again in the Viva, to show that breadth. I think even in your presentation, it's a good idea to also balance out your theoretical contribution with your practical contributions as well. What could somebody or organization or society take away from what you've done and implement it to make it a better place? So that's what I like to ask.
Next question, Farrell.
Right. So this is also from Doug, and his question goes, so like presentation skill of the candidate important for a Viva, and maybe do you want to ask the next one, or just want to address this one first?
Let's go with that one. I mean, we touched, both Mike and I touched on before a discussion about, look, if English is not perhaps your native tongue, that there are ways to approach it. I think this comes down to a slightly different one. How do we actually present? I personally feel that at PhD level, you should be capable of delivering a reasonably strong presentation. I don't want to answer the question with a yes or no, because if you get to the stage that you are defending your doctorate, but you are still not competent to present to an audience, then I don't feel that you deserve to be in the room as a PhD candidate about to graduate. I think the communication of our research through written forms, through verbal or vocal forms, presentations, whether it be a simple presentation to two people, or whether it be a town hall, or whether it be something greater, conference, or so forth. I feel that is part and parcel, but I also recognize that that's my personal view on the matter, and not everybody's going to agree with me. I don't think we're going to have a box that says, presentation, a candidate's presentation skills, 10% of final grade. It's not undergraduate in that way. But I do believe that at doctoral level, we certainly need to be able to have public communication skills that are reasonable. We may get nervous. That's a common thing. I still get nervous every time I give a presentation. And I've been doing it for a couple of years, but the nervousness still gets there in that sense. We have to work on that ourselves, and we've got to be able to take some time to reflect and develop our skills. Early on in the research journey, we might recognize that we lack certain skills. Say, for example, I'm not a quantitative person, but I have to engage with quantitative approaches. So I'm going to upskill myself. We have to be able to recognize and say, you know what, I'm not that great as a presenter. How can I do this? So do I join Toastmasters? Do I spend a bit of time with some people in the department and try to polish my skills and so forth? So it becomes a evolving skill for us. Mike, do you want to add to that?
I think the presentation is really important in the following sense. The presentation should not be a structure of your thesis. Okay. Remember, think about the audience that you're presenting. They've already read your thesis. They've come in there prepared, and they're not just looking at it the night before, hopefully, not the night before, and coming in there. They've read the document, they've analyzed it in detail, so they know the general structure. But often what happens is people just present it exactly as it's structured. No, right? Think about your presentation structure You've only got sometimes 15 to 20 minutes. You want to get across the right information, the information that is important to your thesis, and not everything else. You don't need to have a look at, let's say, the micro decisions. So, for example, some good practices that I've seen recently. When someone is presenting their findings, they may often present also how many so if they did interviews, they look at the profile of all the interviewees. That's not the spot to do it. Okay. You should just be saying, I chose this methodology and I had X amount of interviews. Or they present their entire statistical results. Well, you don't. You just want to say what hypothesis you'd put forward, what were your main statistical findings, and put them out in rather simplicity to say, I presented these hypotheses, I developed this model, these are the hypotheses as part of it, these are what was supported, these were not. If you've come up with a framework at the end, your thesis, present your framework and then talk about your contributions as both, let's say, to a specific field and as part of a larger field. So that's a skill there, right? It's not just a repeating of every chapter in your thesis, right? I've seen ones where they don't really include a literature review. They just put in a theoretical model and they say, this is the model I'm working on my thesis. This is what's guided my thinking. The literature review will become later on in the specific document. Right.
I want to touch on something you said, Mike, because I know you made a joke about preparing the night before. Everything tonight in our discussion has been about how candidates can prepare. How long as an examiner does it take you to prepare to conduct or to be part of a Viva? What goes into it from your side? Because I think most of the candidates never think about how much time and energy goes in from the examiner's side to prepare to ask the questions. It's not, as you said, it's not just, oh, let me have a quick read of a chapter the night before. There's a lot more from the other side of the equation.
So first of all, I think it begins with you having a conversation. I don't know how it is in your institutions. I know some institutions, their examiners are selected by a panel and the supervisor doesn't have any say. That's not the case at Nottingham. We encourage the supervisors and the candidates put forward a panel or a list of people, which we then vet to see is suitable, right? So what we mean by vet by suitable. So my area is entrepreneurship and management. I wouldn't be asked to, if I got an email saying, could you please do the Viva for somebody in languages, and then I'd say politely no, because I'm not doing that person a favor. Okay, I'm not doing that person a favor. So somebody's skilled enough to understand the nuances of the field, and they may not be an expert entirely in that field, but in a side field, yes. For me, the process is about 48 hours. That's what I usually put. So I usually have a quick read of the thesis. You're often sent an electronic copy of it. There used to be a full copy. You have a quick read of it, and then I would go in more detail and read it in a more supervisory, looking at how, again, decisions are made, why decisions are made, not just how, but why. Looking for any obvious sort of gaps that a person may feel out. Like, let's say, what is the literature base that the person is touching on? Is the literature base appropriate for the study that they're in? Is there any literature that they are really missing that they really need to actually put in there? Has the candidate explained their rationale for their thesis? That is, have they formulated a sufficient research question by demonstrating some gaps or something like that? Then I look at sort of the results and the methodology and the overall contribution. I then go off and make specific notes on those and then refine the notes as I go along, and then hopefully produce a report which is it. my style is I don't do sentence by sentence, and I've seen some examiners' reports where they comment on every paragraph. That's not me. I look at the whole chapter and say what was good about that chapter, what was bad about it, what was really missing, what needs to be improved. So that's my style, and everyone's a bit different. So it's about 2 days, 2 or 3 days for someone who's done that quite a while. Obviously, for a new person, it could be longer, right? It's again, maybe you are reading 100,000 words in some instances.
Yeah, it's not a light read or a short story for
Yeah.
certain. Okay, any other questions, Farrell?
Yeah, also from John, because if the examiner asks how the descriptive statistics of the data collected affect the results, how should we answer this?
That's a quantitative question, and that's Mike's.
I like how we do it. So I would just go to the results section and just explain how they actually affect the thing. Again, you must have some rationale for including those demographic characteristics. Did you say it was descriptive statistics? Sorry, yeah, descriptive statistics. You made some choices there. Yeah, they can give some insights. They cannot. It's up to you whether they were actually included as part of your analysis or not.
I think also so I guess this is, I think the reason he asked this is because he probably has the option. Shall asked, in terms of an online Viva versus a physical one, which is better for the candidates?
Ooh.
Oh,
I don't want to answer that because we're all different. I personally, my teaching online I love, but any real interaction I want to have in a room with people. That's a really unique question to address.
Okay, so questions from
this is an interesting, because the Viva is a unique experience.
Yeah.
In my view, you're hopefully going to do only one Viva. No, you're not going to hopefully do many.
Fair point. Yeah.
I can see two ways to this. Obviously, if your external examiners are not in the country, then you've got really three options. You can do it completely online. I am, in my biasness, against that. I think you should try and do it face to face as much as possible. Why? Simply because you can see what the other parties are doing as well, because it's also a strategy in how you're going to deal with the questions, and they can also see you as well in physical. There may be a hybrid option where some of you are physical and the external dials in from across the globe. Even that's, I think, a better option than just purely online. Because online it can be daunting in a Zoom environment. So, for example, the recent ones I did with New Zealand, obviously I wasn't in New Zealand. From the candidate's perspective, this was online. The candidate's perspective, it was just a blank screen. They were technology issues. People were asked to be put on mute, and you're wondering, well, are these people really listening to what I'm saying? Or are they checking their emails? Are they doing something else on the internet? Whatever. So that's the bit that I would try and remove and try and control the situation as much as possible.
I think I want to touch on one other thing, knowing that it was Jap who asked this question, because he's in East Malaysia, the university, his supervisors, where they're going to do the Viva is actually in KL. So that will require him to travel to his university to be able to do it. And, it might be, oh, look, online saves me the travel time and stuff like this. But I would just say, make sure that if you're traveling as a candidate, if you're traveling to do the Viva, come a couple of days early, get yourself in the right headspace. because I think that is also a factor for some candidates if this is an option. If you can afford to do it face to face, if the resources are there, that would be my preference. But don't travel go ready to defend your dissertation at 2 p.m. Have a day or two to get acclimatized to wherever you're going as well.
Yeah, totally agree. And if you are going to do it somewhere, go into the venue beforehand, check it out, see what it's like. Get all the audio, get all the video, whatever needs or presentation needs to be done. Get it done.